now with that introduction, with that background of why we stumble in understanding Paul's letters, Paul's writings, and Paul himself, now let's specifically look at the book of Galatians, because this is the book that's often quoted to make the argument. First of all, Paul's writing this letter to believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. And he begins in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. He says, the gospel which is preached of me is not after man, neither was I taught it, but it came by revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach. Now, why does he make the point that was not after man? Because if you follow the Torah according to what the rabbis have already determined in their rulings, you're following after their interpretation. You're following it, the Torah, after man. And that's how he learned the Torah. He was taught the Torah by Gamaliel. That's how those in Galatians are striving to express their faith in Yeshua as the Messiah. So he's saying that I was not instructed in this understanding by Gamaliel. It came by revelation of Yeshua the Messiah. And then he says in Galatians 1:13, for you have heard of my conversation. That's an old English way of saying lifestyle. You have heard of my lifestyle in time past in the Jews' religion. Now, the Jews' religion is Pharisaic oral law. And he said he profited in the Jews' religion. See, we might read the Jews' religion as following the law. No. The Jews' religion is how they follow the law and how they interpret the law, which Judaism, once again, says that there was a written law and an oral law, and the oral law supersedes the written law, and the rabbis were given the authority to make judgments on the Torah. So he says, I profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the, look what he says, the tradition of the fathers. Now, if you just have a kindergarten understanding of the Jews' religion, it's blatantly clear what the tradition of the fathers is. But we don't even have a kindergarten understanding, because we interpret the tradition of the fathers as the law, the written law. Now, the tradition of the fathers is the oral law, the rabbi's interpretation, and the rabbi's explanation, and the rabbi's rules. And so he's specifically identifying himself and his path with following rabbinic oral law. So this phrase, tradition of the fathers, is found in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. It says, then came to Yeshua scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, why do the disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, or the tradition of the fathers? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. Is it specified in the written Torah that you must wash your hands before you eat? Is that one of the 613 commandments? No, but it is a tradition of the elders. It is a tradition of the fathers. Judaism today teaches that if you go into a home of an Orthodox Jew, before he eats, he's going to go and wash his hands. And so Paul was talking about the Pharisaic oral law, the tradition of the fathers. And in Acts chapter 23, verse 6, Paul testified, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, Philippians 3:5, of the tribe of Benjamin. As touching the Torah, or how I understood the Torah and sought to follow the Torah, I did it according to the Pharisaic understanding. And then in Acts chapter 21, verse 40, Paul spake unto them, saying, I am verily a man which am a Jew, brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the perfect manner of the Torah of our fathers. So who's Gamaliel? Gamaliel the elder, also Rabbi Gamaliel the first, was a leading authority in the Sanhedrin in the mid-1st century. He was the grandson of the great Jewish teacher Hillel. Now, in the 1st century, the Pharisees were in two major groups. One studied under Shammai, and the other studied under Hillel. And they differed with each other and debated and fought with each other according to various matters of the Torah. And Paul learned under Gamaliel, who is the grandson of Hillel. And Hillel died 20 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. In Acts 26, verse 5, Paul says, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify, that after the most strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. Now, today, the most strictest sect of Judaism would be ultra-Orthodox Judaism, those that wear the black hats and the black coats. So, Paul was one of the black hats and the black coats. So now in Galatians chapter 1, verse 1, Paul, an apostle unto the churches of Galatia. And he says in verses 6 and 7, I marvel, I'm astonished, that you are so soon removed from him unto another gospel, and that you would pervert the gospel of the Messiah. So when we read this, how do we interpret another gospel? We interpret it as following the law versus believing in Yeshua. That's how we interpret another gospel. But you know what? If you are in this movement and fellowship with people who are in the movement of the Hebraic roots or the Hebraic roots of Christianity, among people that try to express their faith in Yeshua as the Messiah by keeping the Sabbath, by keeping Passover, by not eating pig, etc., as I have, and I've been traveling around, initially the United States and now around the world for the last 17 years, giving weekend seminars, speaking at conferences and things. In the beginning, when I first shared this message, pretty much my audience were people that were already in the churches. They were going to existing Sunday churches, and they were taught, and they were thinking age of law, age of grace. But they were interested, and they were seeking and searching for truth. So they came out to hear. And so when they heard this message, and it resonated within them that this is what the New Testament says, this is what Yeshua taught, that large numbers of people received the message. And so initially, I was sharing this message 17 years ago, 1997. And so I know people that I shared this message with that were in the Sunday church and were eating pig and were celebrating Christmas and Easter. And they received this message, heard the message in 97, 98, 99. And here we are, 15 years later after 1999, and some of those places that I taught and some of the people that received the message, some of them have converted to Judaism. Some of them are now trying to follow the Torah according to what the rabbis say. And, you know, we got to do the service exactly the way they do it in the synagogue on the Sabbath, in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. We got to do it exactly that way. We have to do the exact prayers, and we have to do everything the exact way, and we've got to do Passover exactly how it was done. And if we don't do it that way, you know, we're not doing it right. We're supposed to follow the Torah now. We're not supposed to be like the church that doesn't know how to do it. We got to follow the Torah now. And so they align themselves up, you know, kosher. Well, you know, the rabbis say I can't mix meat and milk. So, you know, we can't mix meat and milk. And so I, after initially, in 1997, before my first audience, and in my mind, they're all there, and they're staring at me. And they're saying in their mind, we're not under the law, we're not under the law. What's he trying to say? We're supposed to follow the law, we're not under the law. And I'm sitting there going, how am I gotta share the Bible and get them to not throw stones at me? And so if you would have told me in that day that they were going to go from thinking, we're not under the law, we're under the law. Who's he to say we're not under the law? Doesn't he know what Galatians says? To then receiving the message, to start keeping Sabbath, to start keeping Passover, and then think the thought that we should convert to Judaism, or think the thought that, no, we got to do it how the rabbis think and how the rabbis do it. And that has happened. And I'm sitting here after initially witnessing people in 1997 and speaking to that type of audience, and now witnessing over the last 15 years that people have done this. I'm sitting here, I'm flabbergasted. I'm astonished. I am marveled. I can't even comprehend. It doesn't even register in my mind how they went to church all those years. And the New Testament explicitly says, Yeshua says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It explicitly says you're saved by grace through faith. It explicitly says what the blood of Messiah did for you. And they've heard that. And they know that that is true. And yet they dismiss it. They throw it away. And they even question whether Yeshua is the Messiah or not. And then they even question whether the New Testament is really valid and true and whether we should believe it. Because there's some things we don't know about it. And I am marveled that would happen. Like Paul's saying, I'm astonished. And so what I've witnessed and seen over the last 15, 16, 17 years, Paul was witnessing and seeing. And just like I'm shocked. You were testifying that you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. I mean, it was hammered into you that you're saved by grace through faith. How is it that you think that Yeshua is not even the Messiah now? And so, in that regard, I can relate and see what Paul was referring to. And so what he was expressing strong objection to was that these believers that he was writing to in Galatians, they believed that Yeshua was the Messiah, but they were trying to follow the Torah through the teachings and the lens and the perspective of Rabbinic Judaism. So it wasn't Yeshua or the Torah, it was follow Yeshua in the Torah the right way. And so this issue of dispute was not something that Paul just dealt with when he wrote the letter of Galatians. It was an issue in Rome. It was an issue with the Romans. It was an issue in Acts chapter 15. Because in Acts chapter 15, verse 5, it says, there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees. Oh, that's the sect that Paul's of. A sect of the Pharisees which believed. There was a dispute between Pharisees who believed that Yeshua was the Messiah. A dispute among them over whether he's the Messiah or not? No. A dispute about the proper way to follow the Torah. And they said that it was needful to circumcise them and command them to keep the Torah of Moses. Now, when we read that, because we don't have an understanding, just a basic understanding of Pharisees who believed in what they would believe, we read that they were arguing whether you should follow the Torah or not. They're not arguing whether you should follow the Torah. That's a given. They were arguing the proper way to follow the Torah. And so this phrase, circumcise them, we read them like they're arguing whether, that was the issue. That one issue only, whether you should be physically circumcised or not. They were arguing about the commandment of physical circumcision. No. To circumcise them is a euphemism for being in covenant with the God of Israel, and being in covenant means you're to follow his Torah. And so circumcise meant to keep the Torah, and to keep the Torah for the Pharisees means you have to go through a conversion process. Don't believe that? Today in Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism, if a non-Jew approaches a rabbi and says, I want to follow the Torah, he will say, we do not recognize you as being in covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. See, the reason why you got to convert means you make a transition from who and what you are now, and after you convert, you become something else. You're given a new label. You're given a new status. That's what convert means. You're given a new label. You're given a new status. So what was the status that they previously see you as before you convert? They see that you're not in covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, a Christian sees that he believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and is in covenant with him. A Jew does not accept that as being so. And so in order for a Jew to accept that it's so, you got to go through a conversion. And if you're male, you got to get circumcised. And the circumcision is the act of the conversion. It's the act that you are declaring that you are converting, and you are making a commitment by converting to follow the Torah. So conversion is a euphemism or a way of expressing to get into relationship with the God of Israel and to make a commitment to follow his Torah. So these Pharisees which believed were saying that a non-Jew must convert in order to be accepted into the family of the God of Israel. So what would that process involve? Well, here at the website, beingjewish.com, it will tell you the process for a non-Jew to convert. Number one, when a Gentile wants to become Jewish, the rabbis are required to try to tell him he shouldn't. As a matter of fact, they try to tell you 3 times. And after the 3rd time you say, well, I still want to convert, now they're obligated to go through the process. But they're supposed to tell you no 3 times. Can I convert to Judaism and still believe in Jesus, in Yeshua? The answer is no. This is not something negotiable in Judaism. And so, if it's done honestly, the conversion means you're rejecting the Messiah. There is only one way to become Jewish. That way is through an Orthodox Jewish court. To begin with, you need to find a rabbi. And you will have to study a great deal. And then you will have to study more. When your rabbi feels that you are ready for conversion, in other words, you have a grasp of what it means to follow the Torah and to live this lifestyle, he will test you on the materials he gave you to study. A rabbi will bring you before a rabbinic court and set up an appointment schedule. The rabbi may still try to dissuade you a little bit, and the court certainly will try. When they are satisfied that you should be converted and you are sincere, they will set up the actual arrangements. For men, they will need to get circumcised. Men who are already circumcised undergo a ceremony known as Hatafat Dam Brit. This means that a small drop of blood is taken during the circumcision or the covenant ceremony. So circumcision is synonymous with conversion, which is synonymous with the commitment to follow the Torah. And so in Acts chapter 15, the Pharisees which believed, some of them were arguing that the non-Jew should do that. And then continuing on, one of the most fundamental rules in Judaism is to respect and honor the rabbis and the halakhic authorities. And it is impossible to properly fulfill Judaism unless you are part of the Jewish community and the congregation. Notice you must respect the rabbis and halakhic authorities. That means, you know, what the New Testament says is irrelevant. What Yeshua says is irrelevant. It's what the rabbis say that you are making a commitment to do and to follow. And so, once you understand that Yeshua gave the Torah, and he wants us to follow that Torah by his Spirit, then why are you entering into a covenant to do what the rabbis say when they didn't give the Torah? And their rulings is in effect replacing Yeshua. And so you see why Paul was so strongly opposed in Acts chapter 15? So Acts chapter 15, verse 1. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, that except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. So because of that phrase, this is read like everybody in the first century were Baptists. And they were all going to a Baptist church and they were arguing about how you get saved. No. If you would go to a Jew and say, are you saved? They'll look at you like, what in the world are you talking about? I am a part of a covenant people. And we are a Jewish community. And we are a people. What are you talking about? Getting saved. And so, you know, these weren't some Baptists that were having a debate with a Jew. These were Pharisaic believers, one of which was Paul, having this debate. And to be saved, what they were really arguing is, how do you become to be a part of the accepted community of Israel? In verse 2, it says, Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension or dispute with them. I mean, they had an intense argument over the issue. So now, I want you to see this phrase where in Galatians 1, Paul is marveling that there are those that he's writing to, non-Jewish believers in Messiah. He's stunned that they've gone to another gospel. That is the teaching of the rabbis, of the Pharisees. And it says in verse 7, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Messiah. So that phrase, some that trouble you, is a reference to the non-Jewish believers in Yeshua who were trying to follow the Torah under the teachings and the instructions of the rabbis, rather than believing in Yeshua and doing it by his Spirit. That phrase, some that trouble you. So after the ruling in Acts chapter 15, you remember the four things? It says in Acts 15, verse 24, for as much as we have heard that some which went out from us have troubled you, saying, we must be circumcised and to keep the law, to whom we gave such commandment. So if you're ignorant of the issue of debate, if you're ignorant of Pharisaic Jewish belief, and if you just was shown that verse, see, here's the proof text. Look what it said in Acts chapter 15. See what it says. See, they said, we didn't give you no commandment to keep the law. So you're reading the words, but you have no idea the meaning of the words that you're reading. They gave no such commandment that the non-Jews should go through a circumcision, according to the rabbinic instruction and authority as a means to keep the law. That's what they gave no such instruction regard. So do you see how and why so easily we can read the verse and come to a wrong conclusion? Because we don't know the Hebraic background of it. So it says that there was no small dispute. And so actually what they're doing is they're having a Torah dispute. If you would ask most Christians, does the Torah teach that you should be circumcised? And they would say, well, yeah, they're aware of that. But how many Christians are aware of Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 and 16, where it says, now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Verse 16, circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be no more stiff-necked. How many Christians know that the Torah requires circumcision of the heart? You see, now they're reading Paul and coming to a conclusion about the Torah, and they don't even know the Torah. They're thinking that it's the new covenant that's the circumcision of the heart, and they think that the Torah is the circumcision of the flesh. Now we got a contrast between the new covenant, which now it's grace, and whether you should follow the Torah. Because they don't know that the Torah requires circumcision of the heart. So now you see that the Torah requires circumcision of the heart. Does the Torah also speak of circumcision of the flesh? Yeah, it speaks of both. Okay? So now, in a traditional Hebraic fashion, the question should be asked, in what context? Now you have to understand a principle, and that is some Torah commandments are weightier than others. See, it says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, whoever breaks the least of the commandments. Well, if every commandment was equal, there's no commandments that are going to be called least. And there's no commandments that are going to be called the greatest, if they're all equal. So, if you break any one of them, you sin because it's a covenant. If you break the smallest part, you've broken the covenant. You've sinned. But they're all not equal. In Matthew 23:23, Yeshua said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and you've omitted the weightier matters of the Torah." You see, not all issues have equal weight, because these issues, judgment, mercy, and faith, are weightier than that issue. So now we have the principle that not all Torah commandments are equal. So now we can have a debate. Which has the greater weight? Circumcision of the flesh or circumcision of the heart? So what was Paul's perspective of the issue? Well, in Acts chapter 15, we're not told. But he elaborately explains his position in Romans chapter 2. And in the book of Romans in general. Romans chapter 2, Romans chapter 4. So here's the way that he's going to present his argument. He's going to go back to Abraham, who is accepted as the father of the faith. So let's see Abraham as our example, because the things that happened to the forefathers are examples to us. So let's see Abraham's example. Romans 4:1. What shall we say then what Abraham our father as pertaining to the flesh is found? If Abraham was justified by works, his own merit, then he has the glory. I mean, he could say, look, I did it. You didn't do it. I did it. I deserve it. You don't. But that doesn't give glory to God. But what says the scripture? Abraham believed God and was counted to him for righteousness. This is quoting Acts chapter 15 in verse 6. And so if we go to Genesis chapter 12, we see that Abraham was given an instruction and a promise. An instruction and a promise. The instruction is, get you out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house in the land that I will show you. That's the instruction. Here's the promise. If you do that, I will make of you a great nation. So the blessing of Abraham was by promise. And so Paul is quoting in Romans 4:3, Abraham believed God and was counted him for righteousness. He's quoting Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. He believed in the Lord, it was counted to him for righteousness. This word believe is aman, and it's the root of the word for faith in Hebrew, amunah. And so Abraham, by his faith, it was counted for righteousness. And so then, Paul makes the point. How was it reckoned? How was Abraham counted as righteous before God? Right here in Genesis 15, verse 6. When he was circumcised or uncircumcised? At this moment, Paul's saying, was he circumcised or not circumcised? He was not circumcised. Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And then he says, he received the sign of circumcision, the seal. Circumcision is the sign and the seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had being uncircumcised. So notice what Paul's saying is the physical circumcision didn't establish the relationship. The physical circumcision didn't establish the right standing. It was when he followed the instruction of God. So Paul says in Romans 4:11 that he, Abraham, might be the father of all them that believe. Like, he's the example. So he's using the Torah to prove his point. And what he was referring to was Genesis chapter 17. that God said to Abraham, you will keep my covenant, and this is my covenant you shall keep between me and you. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. It will be a token. It's a sign of the covenant. It didn't establish the covenant. It didn't make him in right standing. After he was in right standing, then this was the sign and the seal to everyone that he is in covenant with God. And he was counted as righteousness because of, in effect, the circumcision of his heart. And so that's a good place that we can stop, and we can take our first break, ever how long we want to make it. And we'll continue in looking at Paul, looking at the Torah, looking at Galatians when we resume our teaching. So let's all have good fellowship and have a good break, okay?